Hi, I'm Adam Drake from Mugen Seiki Racing. Today I'm going to disassemble an OS Speed B21 Adam Drake Edition engine. I'm going to show you some things that you should look for if you ever decide to disassemble your engine to make sure you don't cause any damage. I'm going to remove the bearings, install new bearings, and then just kind of show you how I assemble the engine back together and make sure that there's a few key things that you need to pay attention to make sure you don't cause any harm or damage to your Nitro engine. So I'm going to go ahead and start disassembling this OS Speed B21 Adam Drake Edition engine. You always want to make sure that you have either like a brand new or clean blue shop towel or microfiber towel when doing this. Even if it's an older engine and you're getting ready to service the engine, it's always best to start with clean towel. That way you can see if there's any dirt or kind of imperfections in anything. So we're going to go ahead and just start by removing the 4 backplate screws. And one thing that you really want to make sure of when removing the 4 backplate screws is to twist the crankshaft and make sure that the piston is at top dead center. It doesn't have to be all the way at top dead center, but it needs to not be at bottom dead center, because with some engines, when you go to remove the backplate can actually catch on the skirt of the piston and it can break the piston. So just make sure that you turn it until there's a little bit of tension. You can look in the exhaust port and make sure that the piston is kind of towards the top of its stroke, and then you can go ahead and remove the 4 backplate screws and the backplate. Okay, so now we have the backplate removed. The part's laid out on the blue shop towel. Now I'm going to go ahead and remove the cooling head and the head button. I like to start by removing the 4 screws, taking the cooling head off, but leaving the head button still secured into the sleeve of the engine. Then when I go to remove the head button, I'll actually turn the engine upside down and remove the head button. That way, if there's any dust or dirt in between the head button and the case, it falls out and doesn't fall down into the engine. So let's go ahead and remove the head and the head button, and then we'll move on to the next step. Okay, so we have the head button removed, cooling head. I used a new microfiber towel to kind of wipe off around the top of the case and top of the sleeve. I did the same thing with the head button, because again, sometimes you get a little bit of dust and dirt around here, and you just want to make sure that none of that dust or dirt falls down into the engine. So from here, I just go ahead, grab the sleeve with my finger. If it's an engine that's been run a bunch, it'll be too tight. You won't be able to get it out. If it's a newer engine, a lot of times it'll slide right out. So since this engine has a little bit of time on it, we're going to go ahead and install a clutch nut. Then we'll take a large zip tie, slide it through the exhaust port, and then just take our flash point wrench, and you'll just push till the sleeve starts to come up. Then put the piston back down, and you should be able to grab and pull the sleeve out. If it's still tight, you can take a flathead screwdriver, or even 2 if it's really tight, and get on each side, and you'll want to apply equal pressure so that the sleeve slides out the top. So again, we'll take our clean microfiber towel, wipe down all the parts. Now, a couple things that you really need to pay close attention to is the orientation of these parts. So Obviously, this large port here is the exhaust port. It has a small notch. That notch lines up with this pin in the case. So when you go to reassemble everything, you have to make sure that the sleeve is oriented to where that groove lines up with the pin. As far as the piston goes, there is a long side of the piston that always goes towards the back of the engine or towards the back plate. The short side of the engine or of the piston is relieved so that it clears the crankshaft as the piston's going up and down. If you put the piston in backwards with some engines, depending on the length of the stroke, the piston can crash into the back plate and can cause the piston to break. So you really got to pay close attention to make sure that you put the piston in the right direction. I've seen people put the piston in backwards, and if it's a square stroke or short stroke engine, a lot of times it will clear the back plate and the engine will start up, but it's going to run really bad. It's going to have no bottom end, be really difficult to tune, and can just become a nightmare. Again, it will run. It doesn't necessarily cause any major problems, but with some engines, depending on the stroke length, you can actually break the piston. So now we're going to go ahead and remove the crankshaft, and I'll get my bearing tools and we'll remove the front and rear bearing. As you can see on this piston, the rod and also the head button, there's a little bit of blue dye. This isn't one of my personal engines. This is an engine that I'm working on for a buddy, and he uses a fuel that has a little bit of dye. So nothing really to be concerned with, but everything looks pretty clean. Just has a little bit of a blue tint to it. So we're going to start by removing the front bearing. And with having proper bearing tools, it makes this process super easy. You just basically thread this down. It pulls that shaft and pushes the front bearing out like that. The rear bearing, these tools normally come in a set. This is kind of an old school set that I have from a long time ago that's not made anymore, but all the ones on the market nowadays are very similar. Same type of deal. Once it's in there, tightens down on the inner bearing race, and the bearing slides right out. So a couple things as far as the bearings go to look for when assembling new ones is obviously there you can see the inner cage of the bearing. You want to make sure that the balls are facing the back plate. So the side where you just see the back side of the cage will go towards the inside. As far as the front bearing goes, you'll want to make sure that the rubber seal faces the outside so it can keep any dust or dirt out. Typically, you'll want to remove the inner rubber seal if it has one. That way the bearing can get some fuel and oil to help lubricate it over time. So I'm going to grab a new set of bearings, and then I'm going to show you how to install those. Okay, so we have the new bearings. With the bearing tool, we're just going to remove the spacer that pushes is used to push the front bearing out. Go ahead and install the bearing onto the tool. Again, the ball's facing towards the outside. You'll slide that into the crankcase, and the front bearing with the rubber seal facing the outside. And then you just go ahead and tighten this down. As you're tightening it down, it basically just aligns and presses both the front and rear bearing at the same time into the crankcase. You'll feel it bottom out. You don't really need to crank it down super tight, but just make sure that the bearings are fully seated into the case. drop the crankshaft into the case. That should be a really nice smooth fit if the bearings are aligned properly. Again, taking the piston and rod, making sure that the long end of the piston is facing the back side of the engine. And then I'll start with the piston at bottom dead center when you start to slide the sleeve back into the case. Once you have the sleeve about 1/3 of the way in, you'll just gently turn the crankshaft until the piston kind of aligns itself within the sleeve. Again, making sure that this notch in the sleeve lines up with the pin, and you'll press that all the way down. You'll then want to check in the exhaust port and make sure that the sleeve is seated all the way down. So from there, I make sure that the piston is towards the top of the stroke or near top dead center. That way when you slide the back plate on, there's no chance of it catching the bottom of the piston. And then we'll go ahead and secure the 4 back plate screws. So from there, I'll take the piston now and put it towards the bottom of the stroke. Otherwise, when it's at top dead center, when you go to put the head button on, there'll be a little bit of pressure and it'll want to kind of pop up. Go ahead and put the cooling head on and then tighten those 4 screws down. So it's pretty much as simple as that. Again, just a couple things that you want to look for to make sure that you don't damage any of the internals of the engine. But for the most part, it's a pretty simple process to disassemble the engine, remove the bearings as long as you have the proper bearing tools. And from there, you can put the clutch assembly, exhaust, air filter back on the engine and get back out on the track.